Haunted Ohio, Volume 1, by Chris Woodyard. Chapter 5, Old Soldiers Never Die. Rude phone. Custard's last march, John Brown's soul. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. Old soldiers never die, they just fade. Ghostly soldiers rise to refight Civil War battles. Spectral pilots return to the planes they loved in life. Whether they rise to rattle sabers or rattle their bones, Ohio's phantom forces continue to soldier on. Death on a Pale Horse. In horse and buggy days, a young woman and her beau were driving home from a church social. The moon was out, and they were approached Bouquet's watering trough in Coshocton County. They saw a beautiful white horse, luminous as a ghost, approaching on Mill Creek Road. The horse's rider wore a uniform of the Revolutionary War period. In the bright light of the moon, they could see the polished buttons on his coat and vest, the milky white ruffles of his sleeves, the shiny riding boots, every detail except his face, which was hidden in the shadow of his three-cornered hat. As the mysterious rider drew abreast, the couple's horse began to plunge and shy. The driver fought to keep the horse from bolting, and then tried to get past the horse and rider. As he did so, the pale horse cut in front of them and went straight up the hill, pacing as evenly as if they were on level ground. The shocked couple watched the horse and rider climb the impossibly steep hill, growing fainter and fainter, and finally fading away like a glimmer of moonlight. A Revolutionary War ghost. One of the spooks at Patrick's parents' home in Dayton was a Revolutionary War soldier who would appear for a few seconds in the backyard and then disappear. He wore a double-breasted blue uniform coat, tight-fitting breeches, and high black boots and from the uniform, Patrick theorizes that the soldier died when the American Army of 1812 was making its way to Lake Erie. Some units bivouated in the Dayton area. Many soldiers were felled by sickness or by wolves. One lone soldier who missed the roll call up yonder still stands his post. The Ghost of Simon Girty. Simon Girty was a renegade, adopted as a young man by the Seneca. He sided with the British to unsettle the Ohio Territory. He laughed as his comrades tortured and burned his stepfather. He led an Indian war party against Colonel Crawford's troops and watched Crawford burn at the stake. For his crimes, Girty was condemned to guard the cannons of Mad Anthony Wayne, which are buried in the cast point of Girty's Island, 7 miles west of Neapolitan. 3 boys who went searching for the cannons saw a lantern bobbing towards them through the underbrush. As the lonely light approached, they saw that this was carried by a man in a fringed shirt and moccasins with a tomahawk tucked in his belt. The ghost of Simon Girty. They fled in terror when they saw that it was the man and not the lantern that gave off the light. The cannon were removed long ago, but Girty is condemned to a unique hell. Every midnight in the cold, stinking sweat of fear he rises to claw the earth away from the ghostly guns, to clean and swab them, to prime them and load them with the shots. As he works, his blood-rimmed eyes dart back and forth frantically, seeing ghostly enemies arising about him. Then he suffers the terrors he delighted in inflicting during his life. Such fear could kill a living man, but Gertie cannot die. Ghost Riders in the Sky. General George Armstrong Custer was born in New Rumley in 1839. At age 23, he was the youngest general in the Union Army. He was dashing and flamboyant, and his men worshipped him, and so did his wife Elizabeth, who wrote several books about their life together. She saw an eerie vision of ghost riders in the sky as Custer and his men departed for their fatal rendezvous at Little Bighorn. From the hour of breaking camp before the sun was up, a mist had enveloped everything. Soon the sun began to penetrate its veil and dispel the haze, and a scene of wonder and beauty appeared. The cavalry and infantry, in the order named, the scouts, the pack mules, and artillery, and behind all the long line of white-covered wagons, made a column altogether some 2 miles in length. As the sun broke through the mist, and as a mirage appeared, which took up half of the line of the sky, and therefore for a little distance it marched equally plain to the sight on the earth and the sky. The future of the heroic land, whose days were even then numbered, seemed to be revealed, and already there seemed a premonition in the supernatural translation as their forms were reflected from opaque mist on the early dawn. With my husband's departure, my last happy days in garrison were ended, as a premonition of danger and disaster that I had never known before weighed me down. I could not shake off the baleful influence of depressing thoughts. This presentiment and suspense, such as I had never known, made me selfish, and I shut into my heart the most uncontrollable anxiety, and could lighten no one else's burden. John Brown's Soul. While John Brown's body lies mouldering in the grave, his soul and possibly his ghost goes marching on. Abolitionist John Brown was born in Connecticut, but his family moved to Ohio when he was 5 years old. His father bought a farm in Hudson, 25 miles south of Cleveland, and established a tannery. Brown grew up to believe in the brotherhood of man, and did all he could to aid runaway slaves. Gradually he was possessed by the idea that he had a divine mission to provoke an uprising of the slaves, who would then fight alongside the white man for his freedom. His disastrous 1859 raid at Harper Ferry, Virginia, led to his capture and hanging. A curious little book, Interviews with Spirits, 1885, contains a post-mortem interview with John Brown obtained through the medium Carrie E.S. Twigg. Brown interpreted a talk between Arthur Samuel Bowles and the late Wendell Phillips, anti-slavery curator. "Mr. Bowles," said Mr. Phillips, "here comes our veteran hero, John Brown, to join in our conversation." "Welcome, brother. Be seated. You know the old adage, birds of a feather, etc.? Well, I at least am not ashamed of my company." John Brown was not as attractive in appearance as Mr. Phillips, but there was an earnestness about him that bespoke candor and truth. "We were talking up this slavery question," said Mr. Phillips, and I wish you would tell Mr. Bowles your sentiments as present. I do not withhold from you, Mr. Bowles, said he, that I have regretted many of my actions while on earth. I placed upon my family the stigma of an ignominious death. I anticipated that which would have finally come. My insurrection was an eye-opener to the colored race held in slavery, and undully incited the slaveholders to excessive reaction. I know many of my plans were ill-advised. In my intense sympathy for the slaves, I did not stop to think that they were a class swayed by the impulses of the moment, reveling in variable moods and wholly uneducated. Therefore my teachings were for a time like throwing bombshells. I could not understand why, having waited all their lives, they might best wait a little longer. Though I lost my earth life by my rash expedition, I have no spirit of revenge. I shudder when I think of my own execution at the scaffold. I do not wish my executioners to meet the same fate, for it is a terrible experience to pass out of earth life that way. I have striven many times to put the most rigorous curb on my will, to remember that the signs of the times were then so different, but I cannot yet. I shall grow out of it, but it will be a slow process, sir. Still, I can only now see where before all was dark. John Brown Jr., Brown's eldest son, was a practicing phrenologist, one who reads a person's character by examining the bumps on the head. He also practiced hypnotism, believed in clairvoyance, and attended seances. In an interview with John Brown Jr. in the Cleveland newspaper, he told of how his father had been confronted and encouraged by the spirit of Diantha, his first wife, and she came to him in a dream shortly before the Harper Ferry incident. John Brown Sr. may have favored the rifle shots over spirit rappings, but he did not totally reject the idea that the dead return. Some say they have seen John Brown on his way to his last battle, his white hair and white beard shining like beacons in the moonlight. The old man is unnaturally tall as he strides forward, soundlessly urging on his phantom host. His beard blows like smoke from a torch designated to set the country on fire. A stray ghost walker with a ghostly gun. John Brown's soul goes marching on. Commands from beyond. In Cincinnati, a ghost gave a young soldier his marching orders. In Cincinnati, the author Emma Herring met a brave young soldier, Lieutenant Emmett, who had been compelled to retire from a career of honorable distinction in the Army on account of the loss of an arm. He was a strong spiritualist and an excellent writing medium. On one occasion, being at a circle where the author was present, he drew from his pocketbook a communication from his spirit father, which read to the following effect, that if he, Frank, would go to war, no bullet which had yet been forged could harm him, no sword could maim him, no fire scorch him, for he, his father in the spirit world, could and would protect him through all the perils of war, and that he, Frank Emmett, would be safer far on the battlefield than on the peaceful scenes of home. How then is it, asked one in the circle, that we see you thus maimed, but still in the uniform of the army? Lieutenant Emmett replied, My spirit father kept his word. I enlisted with the 1st New York Volunteers as a private. I won my present rank step by step, serving in 6 battles and always finding myself forward, sometimes in defiance of orders, in the thickest of every day. Sometimes in defiance of orders, in the thickest of every fray. I have been the target at which 100 muskets were aimed. I have become the center of a forest of swords, and I have had no less than 5 bayonets pointed at my very throat, yet somehow, and in a variety of ways too numerous to relate, I escaped them all without a single scratch. My playgoing comrades used to call me der Freishant, the free shooter, a character in German folklore who sells his soul to the devil in exchange for magic bullets. And I say, I bore a charmed life, but forgetful that my blessed Father's promises of protection extended only to the battlefield, and that he had again and again answered to my poor wife, who was always remonstrated against my continuation in the army. Frank will always be safer on the battlefield than at home whilst the war lasts. I at last yielded to Mary's earnest solicitations, obtained a leave of absence, and went down to New Orleans to spread my furlough with her. The second day of my visit, whilst riding with my wife, her horse took a fright, and I, in my endeavor to my horse took a fright, and I, in my endeavor to arrest him, was thrown down and broke my arm. The poor stump which I now carry is the testimony to the truth of my spirit father's warning. The Unknown Soldier. On old Route 40, somewhere near Zanesville, there is a little brick one-room schoolhouse, now used as a residence. In the fall of 1973, Inez drove from Toledo to visit her parents at their schoolhouse home. They had a pleasant, uneventful visit, and Inez climbed up into the second-story bedroom Saturday night between the midnight and 1 a.m. I went up to go to bed, and I had just laid down. All of a sudden, at the foot of the bed, I saw a wounded soldier. He was wearing what looked like a Civil War uniform. The colors were not vivid, but I knew that it was not a navy or dark blue suit. It was more of a grayish one. The minute I saw it, my heart raced. I sat up. I was so frightened. Immediately it vanished. It was totally unexpected. My heart pounded for quite a while. It looked like a person, but you could see through it to the beams in the ceiling. It was not solid flesh. He had a bandage on his hand, and on his arm and on his leg. There was blood leaking through the bandage on his head. The bandaging was mostly on his right side, like he'd gotten hit on that side, and he had what I think was a crutch, although it was more like a stick, not like our modern crutches. Afterward, my heart was still pounding, and I thought, well, maybe I'm either overtired and hallucinating, or there was some kind of a ghost. Inez seemed extremely reluctant to use the word. Did the house have a reputation for being haunted? Was it built on a cemetery, or had it been used as a hospital during the Civil War? Around Zanesville, there was an underground railroad. That's all I know, says Inez. There were times my younger brother thought that he and his friends saw people walking up the windows of the houses. And they'd go out to look, and there'd be nobody there. They talked about the house being haunted, but that was years ago. Nobody had mentioned it the day I saw it. For a long time I didn't tell anybody because I thought, am I losing my peanuts? I don't quite understand, as far as a person's soul is concerned, where the soul goes, whether ghosts are the soul or just some kind of physical energy. I've often wondered. I would think that the promises of Christ means that he would allow a soul to go on unless it's in a form of purgatory. I don't understand ghosts in a Christian sense unless they're just energy. I mentioned the theory that ghosts are a kind of spectral videotape playing over and over after being recorded by some extreme stress or emotion. Inez is thoughtful. That's kind of what it was like. It wasn't a solid mass, there was a flickering movement, like an old-timey movie. And it didn't stand still. I saw it, and then it got slightly bigger, and then it moved towards me. She shudders. I can actually see it today. I could draw you a picture of it. It made such an impression. Apparently, the sufferings of an unknown soldier had made a vivid impression on the atmosphere of the house. One can only hope that the soldier has gone on to a place where there is no more weeping or pain, and where death shall be no more. The Gray Lady of the Confederate Cemetery. For years, fresh flowers have appeared mysteriously on the grave of Benjamin E. Allen, Company D, 50th Tennessee Regiment of the Confederate Cemetery, along Servient Avenue in Columbus. Flowers have also been found on the grave of the unknown soldier. Are they placed there by sentimental Southern sympathizers? Or are they a token from the ghostly lady in gray? The lady in gray is a young woman, dressed in a gray traveling suit trimmed with black in the style of the 1860s. Her light brown hair is done up in a bun under a gray hat. She always looks down and seems to weep. She floats right through trees and the very solid cemetery gates. In the summer of 1988, during a Civil War reenactment, many participants heard an invisible person crying. The weather was perfectly quiet until a violent gust of wind suddenly blew over tents and tables. Then all was calm again. Was it the lady in gray passing by? And why has she not found and followed her loved one, instead of haunting his grave? The war is over, but grieving and the flowers still go on. Perhaps they will until the South rises again. War and Ouija boards. Wars traditionally stimulate an interest in the possibility of the afterlife. When life's questions are unspeakable, grief-stricken people turn to the supernatural for answers. During the Great War, manufacturers of Ouija boards were overwhelmed with orders and had to expand their operations. The ghost cast a yes vote. Prior to the United States' involvement in World War II, Miss Frances Bolton, Republican congresswoman from Cleveland, was undecided on how to vote in the 1941 Lend-Lease Act. Most fellow Republicans were voting against this measure, which Roosevelt hoped would help send much-needed military equipment to besiege Britain. Bolton was close friends with the highly respected English medium Elian Garrett, who had come to America to have her gifts investigated by researchers at Duke University. Troubled over the vote, Bolton consulted Garrett. At the session, Garrett's spirit guide, Uvani, came through, advising her to vote for the measure. Miss Bolton did, and her vote was decisive in passing this life-saving bill. Security-minded spirits. During the Second World War in 1942, security-minded spirits. During the Second World War in 1942, a spiritualist convention in Cleveland resolved that, for the duration, no medium should ask the spirit of departed servicemen any questions whose answers might furnish military information to enemy agents lurking in the audience. Ghosts of the Air. Dayton is the home of the United States Air Force Museum. Each year, this popular museum draws millions of visitors from all over the world to view exhibits on the history of flight, the Wright brothers, and military aircrafts of all kinds. Anne, who lives in who lives in Beaver Creek, has visited the museum several times. She says she will not go back. The place is so full of death, she says uneasily. There are dead guys looking over my shoulder whenever I stop to look at something. I have to tell them, go away, you're dead. Anne was relieved to hear that other people have experienced the same thing at the museum. I personally believe that it's haunted. Patrick R. has the gift of seeing spirits. He too believes that strange things go on at the museum. Says Patrick, my buddy worked there. He's retired now. They say that a wacko airplane on display with a dummy pilot sitting in the cockpit. One morning they found the pilot thrown out of the airplane on the floor. Of course they thought it was a prank, but the airplane was dusted for prints and nothing was found. Patrick notes that the museum is located on a working Air Force base and contains many valuable exhibits. Security is tight, and it would have been difficult, if not impossible, for a prankster to gain access. My buddy told me that he often heard noises and weird things, like people talking in places where nobody should have been. Tools would get moved mysteriously. A lot of people won't go work there at night, including security guards. Patrick has heard there are some guards who will do anything to get out of work in there after dark. Anne wonders why any guests would hang around airplanes that, for the most part, never crashed and never killed anyone. But Patrick has an idea. He believes that many of the planes contain parts cannibalized from other aircrafts. Ghosts latch on to whatever they are familiar with, and flyers can get very attached to their aircraft. Could these phantom flyers have identified parts from planes they once flew? Patrick thinks that it's likely. Those dead guys, they're still trying to hold on to what they once had.